finals. So, ladies and gentlemen, really getting excited. We are now coming to the semifinals of the entire conference. And in a short while, we should be ready for the final. And I know there are some Arsenal and Real Madrid fans here, so I'm not going to talk about that game that took place yesterday, but to focus on our game on the water sector. And the person who is going to be our moderator for today is Boston, who is the managing director of Osprey Foundation. And he has been patiently waiting and has already taken his seat. And can you please give him and the panel a warm welcome, please? And Lee, you take over.
Thank you very much. I realize we are coming in the post-lunch slot. So anybody who feels the need to stand up and sort of get the circulation moving, that's just fine. We are the warm-up act for the final session. So we'll do our best to get the crowd happy and moving. I've been asked to, I was asked to point out the QR code for the survey, but it's not up there right now. But it will come up at some point. Okay, they really want you to take the survey. So we have a terrific panel this afternoon with a lot of different expertise and perspectives, and I will get to them shortly because trust me, you want to hear from them. We're also going to have plenty of time, I hope, if we manage ourselves well enough, for questions, both from people in the room and people online. So please, as we're talking, write down the questions you may have. Before we get to the panel, I'd like to set the stage for this session with some brief thoughts on three different topics. The first is, what is the topic of this session, which is what we're here to talk about. The second is the rationale for the session. Why does it matter to talk about the topic of leveraging inclusive finance and philanthropy? And the third is the substance of the session. How do you actually do this in practice? So to the first topic, the topic of the session is leveraging inclusive finance and philanthropy. And that refers to money that doesn't require a commercial rate of return. This includes both grants and various types of non-grant financing that require either a below market rate of return or are willing to take an above market risk, one or both of those. It can include impact investments and can come in many forms. It can be low interest loans, what used to be called concessional finance. It can be partial risk guarantees. It can be very risky equity investments. So all different types of instruments. From my perspective, this type of money is the most precious type of investment because it doesn't require a full commercial rate of return. Instead, it's looking primarily at the social or environmental return and only secondarily at the financial return. This doesn't, however, mean that it's necessarily easy to deploy this sort of money or easier to do it than it is with commercial funding. Most of the people who make these types of grants and impact investments use a different type of criteria when deciding what to fund. These criteria can include, but aren't limited to, the following. What is the impact on people's lives? Social, environmental, health, economic, dignity. The second is sustainability. What is the sustainability of the service delivery model? Is it likely to continue working over time? What's the potential to catalyze larger and longer term scale changes? So we're generally not just looking for something that works in the short run. Can you leverage other funding? Can you leverage other approaches, partnerships, and ideas also? And finally, often this type of money is willing to take much larger risks than commercial funding can take, if the potential social and environmental upsides are worth it. So that's talking about the definition of this session. So why is it worthwhile to have a session on this topic? What's the rationale for the topic? If we're realistic about how money flows, then we have to acknowledge that there are a large number of people living in places where it's very unlikely that the water, sanitation, and hygiene services and the other types of water services that they get will be funded by commercial finance. That is the reality from where I sit. And so we have to be aware of that. Where are these people? Many of them are in rural areas, some are in small towns, and even in a lot of urban areas, certainly in places like sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Latin America, parts of Asia, the service providers in those areas are unlikely, at least for now, and maybe for the foreseeable future, to get commercial funding. Why is this the case? This is the case because commercial finance is really about only two things: risk and return. And it seems unlikely that the risk-return profile for serving many of these populations will be sufficiently attractive to commercial funders for some time to come. I give you this assessment based on the characteristics of the population that need to be served, the places where they live, and the service providers that are meant to serve them. So the population characteristics can include the income level of the population, the density of the population, and various sociocultural factors. The location characteristics can be everything from the topography to the geology to the hydrology to the meteorology of the places they live. It can include the political stability and security of where they live, the regulatory climate, including the setting of tariffs, and the business climate, which speaks to the reliability of contract. And the third characteristic here are those of the service providers. Are they managed professionally? What is the quality of the governance? Are they actually oriented to serve customers? So these factors are what determine whether people in a certain location can actually get access to commercial finance, whether they or the service providers can. This is the heart of what creditworthiness, and it also speaks to this area. Finally, what is the substance of this session? How do you actually do this work? It's the sort of work I've been doing for the last 20 years or so, both at Osprey Foundation and before that at the Gates Foundation. And even before that, when I was at International Finance Corporation, we used funding to provide below market finance. So here are 6 different types of instruments that you can, and modalities that you can use, and many of these will come up in the panel discussion. The first is you try to get the most out of the non-repayable WASH funding, the grants and the subsidies, through innovative mechanisms like results-based funding. And we had a terrific session on results-based funding this morning. I am particularly familiar with one of the organizations that gave a presentation, which is Uptime. The second is, can you get governments to allocate their funding for water and sanitation in a more effective and sustainable manner? And this can include approaches such as results-based funding, but instead of being run out of an independent organization and through independent service providers, you do it through the government. The third mechanism is what I would call innovative models for service delivery. These are new and different approaches that are trying to reduce the cost or improve the services. And typically, when they start up, they're not ready to get commercial financing. So these can include safer small water enterprises like Uduma in West Africa, or Saha Global, which is in Ghana, container-based sanitation ventures such as Fresh Life Sanergy in Nairobi and other parts of Africa, or Soil in Haiti, and then initiatives that work across multiple social entrepreneurs such as the Container-Based Sanitation Association. A fourth way of doing this is to identify and pilot access to new sources of revenue related to social and environmental benefits. The most obvious one of these is carbon finance. And another type of this would be what are called environmental service payments, where instead of paying for global environmental benefits, you're paying for local environmental benefits. There are also other types of opportunities where you can bring in funding that might be related to other social benefits. such as health or gender benefits. The fifth approach is what I would call the nudge the market approach, which is to say the market is close to wanting to do something but isn't quite there. And in those situations, you can use instruments like partial risk guarantees, which would share the risk initially with a commercial bank, but eventually they will take over. And finally, the sixth of these approaches is what I would call improving the creditworthiness of service providers. And we've heard a little bit about this when people are talking about taking existing utilities and other service providers that aren't quite ready for commercial finance and getting them there. So that is setting the stage. And now I'm very happy to turn over to our four panelists. I will move. That one's working. Okay. So let me start with Leslie, who's second in line there. Leslie is the lead policy analyst for water finance at WaterAid, a global water organization. She also previously has a lot of experience with an organization called water.org. So we may draw on that experience as well. Leslie, to what extent do current investments in water actually promote social equity? And more specifically, we know that WaterAid is one of the groups behind something called Just Water Partnerships. And maybe you can explain how that could help mitigate water-related inequalities.
Okay. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Louis. And I also wanted to thank the OECD and also the Islamic Development Bank for bringing us all together here, having this conversation, and inviting me to contribute to it. So Louis has already set us up by really starting to define equity, because if I had actually tried to do that, I would have taken up all the time that we had today to discuss that, because it is a deep conversation that is important. And we also heard from Yasmin earlier about how definitions and language really, really matters. But assuming we have a basic understanding of what we mean by equity and equity within water investments, what do we really think has that really been happening and has that been taking place so far? I would say data for some of these items exist, some of these metrics around equity, but not a lot. And definitely not equally across all countries. We can say with relative confidence that most water investments lack KPIs related to social equity. And if we don't have KPIs to really encourage and incentivize and create accountability for this behavior, it's probably getting left out. This comes back, as Louis was setting us up, to understand how markets and private sector actors behave. They behave in their own best interests, not social imperatives. And when markets behave to protect their best interests, that's also why we haven't seen blended finance really delivering across the financial and the social objectives that it is supposed to do. And this has been really publicized and shared through the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. They talked about this in many ways, and I can recall an event basically 1 year ago where one of the commissioners highlighted that that we needed a blended finance 2.0 that had social equity metrics built into it so that we could really achieve what we've all been aspiring to do with blended finance. That name didn't actually carry through to the final report that the commission issued, but the premise that this is a gap that needs to be filled is exactly why the commission proposed that we need just water partnerships in the first place. So that takes me to what are just water partnerships and how can they help us mitigate water-related inequalities? So as you might imagine at this point, just water partnerships are an idea that were put forward by the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. And at their core, Just Water Partnerships are national level platforms that would bring together the necessary financial stakeholders to work together to identify the right decisions around water investments. Now, national platforms for coordination are not new, and many of you here could tell me about many different ones of them. But what makes this idea and this concept new is the application or the insertion of a social equity lens or filter and building that into the decision-making process around the investments. Now, the exact format and the exact structure of this has not been provided because the authors understood that you can't just structure that and it equally apply perfectly in all countries. This needed to be adapted, this needed to be localized, it needed to fit the context and the environment of each country. So involved parties that would be coming together to do this at a national level would include the public sector and the governments. It would also include the private sector, the financial sectors, philanthropy, civil society. Everyone would need to come together to make ambitious investments in water that promote water security for all of us. So when WaterAid started thinking about what it would really take to make this a reality, we started reaching out across our network and our connections and held our own set of consultations in conjunction with the commission. What really surfaced from this was that above all, before we could move this forward, JWPs needed to be defined and they needed to have a set of underlying principles. So fast forward several months and a lot of conversations later, I'm really pleased and excited to share that over the coming month, at some point in May, WaterAid will be launching a multi-stakeholder consultation process to define and develop that set of principles that can really form the cornerstone of Just Water Partnerships. You will all definitely be hearing about that. I will be looking to the OECD to make sure that this information is shared as broadly as possible with this audience. To make sure that we're looking at this issue holistically, we have started to partner with the International Water Management Institute, also here in the room, to help lead and guide this process. So in this way, we have the WASH organization, represented by WaterAid, and we also have the water resource management side, sort of stewarded by IMI. We plan to conduct these consultations over the next mostly online over the next set of the next 4 months or so, and then have draft language that we can bring together to review at Stockholm Water Week in August, and also then continue to review it and refine it online, and be able to launch these principles at the end of the year in alignment with the UN Water Conference. Over this time too, WaterAid has a deeper vision that at least, we could start the trend by at least 2 countries raising their hands and saying, we want to do this. We want to start a Just Water Partnership at home. And we will also be looking to align that with the UN Water Conference itself. And also, hopefully in that way, create a chain of continuity with the subsequent UN Water Conferences. But to get there, right, that's a big vision. To get there, in 2026, we'll also start this consultation process again around what does a Just Water Partnership look like, what support is needed, and what do we need to, and who can provide it and how. I want to take a step back and highlight that with the principles that we're really focused on in 2025, these principles will really form the basis of a framework, because again, we can only lightly sketch what they should adhere to, and then the nuances and the details of what that looks like will have to happen again at the country level, right? We know that localization is necessary. What I've shared as I wind down, what I've shared might not meet everyone's expectations here in terms of structure and what do JWPs really, really mean. But I hope that Louis will appreciate that this failure on my part leaves space for the ground up consultation to materialize and really promote water security and access for all. So thank you.
Yeah, I think this is where, yeah, this one's working now. Leslie, thank you. And there may be further questions either from the other panelists or from the audience about Just Water Partnerships after we hear from the other panelists for now. Secondly, I want to turn to Saeed Hussein Quadri, who is the Director of Resilience and Climate Action Department, Global Practice and Partnerships here at the Islamic Development Bank, which is to say he's one of our hosts. So thank you very much for hosting us. It's been a wonderful venue, and it's been certainly fascinating coming to Jeddah and to Saudi Arabia. So let me ask you this, Saeed. Over the last day and a half, we have heard a lot about Islamic finance. And I've even including a lunchtime conversation I had with one of your colleagues who really, I think, helped me have a much better understanding of it. So in the context of this panel, which is talking about equity and talking about the sort of funding which is not fully commercial, are there aspects of Islamic finance that you would like us to know about?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Louis. And I really appreciate OECD to be working with our teams over here in IsDB to put this together. So before this panel, I'll be honest, Leslie and I were talking a little bit about what sort of remarks would we want to get into. And then I realized that, yes, for the last day and a half, we have heard about Islamic finance in several instances, but it's always worthwhile to sort of recap some of the basics of it before I can give the actual examples in which we are able to capitalize upon. And this is all in the context of social equity, right? So again, the principles of it are on risk sharing, on ethical finance, on inclusiveness, on ensuring ecological balance, on ensuring succession in a just and fair manner. So those are at the principal levels. But in terms of ground realities, so you have some instruments of Islamic finance which are quite equivalent of instruments that you would find elsewhere. So you would have zakat and sadaqah, which is essentially alms giving or philanthropy, right? Pure philanthropy, but it's limited to certain periods. So you have to do it within a year and you have to come back and do it again. That's on the zakat side. Sadaqah is it would be grants that you would give for a longer period. So now you come to endowments, which would be the equivalent of waqf. And then you would have Qard Hasan, which would be sort of zero interest-based loans purely from that perspective. Then you have a little bit more complicated systems, a little bit on mudarabas and musharakas. We don't need to get into that. You actually had a very good session this morning with Professor Asutai and others, which went into takaful, which is insurance. So how do you make these services a lot more affordable? The reason I'm mentioning in this and all this context is to come down to the fact that the way we are looking at financing sustainable development is utilizing a few of these models more. Now, the bank is covering around 258 million people across 258 million people across 57 countries. And we've been, under the WASH sector, it's been $15 billion worth of support. What sort of instruments have we used the most? We've generally used istisna, which is a sort of a unique product that we have in Islamic finance, which is you keep financing based on the way you finance before an asset exists. And then you have installment sale and leasing based oriented financing and waqf and technical assistance, which are essentially grants. So nearly half of it we have financed essentially from istisna, around a third from installment sale, and the rest from a leasing based contract or a grant assistance. In the water context, what does it look like? We're talking about large-scale water infrastructure and hydro projects, rural-urban support, or using the grant financing for feasibility studies and things like that. So that has led the bank to be comfortable in going out there and espousing its modalities and its actual effects in the countries. Nearly 50% of all our water financing has gone to Asia, about 33% to MENA, and 23% to Sub-Saharan Africa, and including Latin America as well. Idrissa and the rest of his team were instrumental in being involved in the One Water Summit over the number of years, especially last year. And we are now comfortable enough to go out there into the market and make commitments that we would want to come back and back it. For instance, when the COP16 happened at the UNCCD, land degradation, desertification, and everything, we announced a $1 billion package over the next 5 years to be able to support that. And on climate front, there have been several of them as well. The main concessional debt instrument that we use to be able to finance these projects at well below market rates is by going to the markets. I think somebody was mentioning how markets are out there for their own interest. We need to make our interest more interesting to the market. So we try to go there with green sukuk, or our equivalent of green bonds, essentially. What we looked at is that we have certain project assets. We have a large number of them. And to be able to go to the market to raise bonds on that, that's been pretty successful. We've raised nearly $5 billion over the last 4 years in green sukuks. And what has that led to? That's led to major mega projects, climate resilient water resources projects in Kazakhstan. That's covering 3,400 kilometers of irrigation networks, or a Maidan Tower project in Azerbaijan. So big mega ticket projects. So we talked about zakat and sadaqah to be able to come up with grants and technical assistance that would help us in feasibility studies. But sukuk-oriented social sukuk, green sukuk, where we would be able to raise funds over there, would be able to generate mega projects and support that across. The other thing that actually helps us to go to the green sukuk markets is to have projects in which we can come back and report. You know, you don't want when the investors are giving you funds, they would want to know how those funds are being mobilized. So it keeps us on our toes to deliver on a very strong result-based management systems as such. We're literally just scratching the surface when it comes to these items. You have specialized groups and entities within the bank called the Islamic Solidarity Fund for Development and the Lives and Livelihood Fund. These are specialized funds who are meant to take water as a special interest and area of focus and do a lot of adaptation-related activities when it comes to that. I'll leave it at that for now, and then I'm happy to come back in on some of these items later. Thank you.
Saeed, thank you. That's actually a very clear picture of what's being done, and there may well be questions from other panelists or from the audience about how those things are going. Third, let's hear from Dominic O'Neill. Dominic is the Executive Director of the UN Sanitation and Hygiene Fund. The focus of the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund is the 3.5 million people in the world without safely managed sanitation. So, Dominic, what approaches do you think are needed to raise both the non-commercial funding and the commercial finance necessary to get these people sanitation? Just a small question.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Just want to thank OECD and the Islamic Development Bank for the warm welcome. Louis, you've said the challenge of 5 minutes. In that 5 minutes, I'm going to give you 5 challenges and 5 solutions. You've mentioned the 3.5 billion people who don't have access to safely managed sanitation. The vast majority of those people are women and girls, and they suffer disproportionately from the lack of access. It's the same for safe access to water as well. We haven't discussed that so much, but this is a session on inclusion and social equity. So I think it's important to keep that very much focused in our minds. Similarly, a lot of those people live in some of the most difficult to finance places that we all work in. So I want to keep those 2 contexts in mind and give you 5 challenges that we're all facing at the moment. One, which again, we haven't covered much, is the seismic change that is happening in the last 90 days in relation to grant-based ODA. This has changed the game for all of us because we've all been talking about blended finance, providing technical assistance. The reality is a lot of the available finance, we simply don't know if it's going to be there in 6, 12 months' time. So we all need to adapt to a new environment. I think this puts a lot more responsibility back onto the financing institutions, DFIs, MDBs, and I'll talk about how we're going to help you work your balance sheet to the bones on this. Second is just a reality check. As the grant-based ODA reduces, a lot of what we're trying to finance is not bankable. And when I say that, I mean it's not bankable in the way that many of us in financing institutions look at bankability. So it means it's probably not within your current risk appetites. It may probably not be within your expectations of a financial return. And one issue that I always get is that it's a very nice idea, Dominic, but your ticket size is too small. I'm sorry, but that is a bureaucratic issue within your own organization about transaction costs. You know, we have 3.5 billion people who need that investment in safely managed sanitation, and saying that our bureaucratic system simply can't handle such a small transaction, for me, is not an acceptable response. So that's challenge number 2. Challenge number 3, we've talked a lot about blended finance. It is not a simple transition to go from a grant-based intervention to a blended finance. There's a lot that needs to happen in terms of the preparing for bankability, etc. I think we need a lot more focus on, in the sanitation space, on the transformation that's required, rather than just the transaction. If we just look for the transaction, then we'll just fund what is currently financeable today. We need to transform in this case, the sanitation sector, so that it is possible to finance more. And we really, and I'll come on to this more, we really need to look at the function and the importance of the nationally embedded financing institutions, public development banks, national development banks. They are the way forward in a lot of this, and I'll talk more about that. Number 4, I'll be a little bit provocative here. I believe that a lot of the current investment portfolios in sanitation are not moving the needle on the 3.5 billion people. I think it was David from the Resilient Water Accelerator who earlier said, you know, the easiest thing is to finance what you can see, what is within your risk appetite, and gives you the financial returns. We know, for example, in Kenya, that between 60 and 70% of the population will never live at the end of a sewer pipe. Yet 80 to 90% of the investment goes into sewer pipes because they are the customers who will pay, and you can get the investment back. I'll talk more about that. It's a similar figure in India, as according to the World Bank Executive Director, Paramaya, who ran the biggest sanitation program in the world. And I'll talk more about it, but we need to focus not just on the project, but on the system around it, in particular, the sanitation economy for non-sewage sanitation. Finally, in terms of the challenges, and the purpose of this session, we do not value the externalities of sanitation. We talk about them. We know if people have access to safe sanitation and hygiene, they will get ill less, their health bill will be less, they'll attend school more, they can be in economic employment more. But we do not put a value on those. We only look at the financial return. And breaking news, sanitation is rarely financially viable on its own. It has to be part of a hybrid structure. And the financial returns alone will never give you a feasible investment. On to the good news, Lewis, and the optimism. And this is our prescription for dealing with the 3.5 billion people within the next 2 minutes. Focus on next generation sanitation. That means non-sewer technology, sustainable financial models, not profitable, sustainable. Profitable if they're great, but sustainable, which include job creation, climate resilient approaches and technology, a strong enabling environment on regulation and compliance, and really strengthening across the whole value chain of the sanitation value chain, not just on elements of it. We need synergies with other sectors, in particular wastewater, nature-based solutions are very amenable to co-investment on sanitation. Most importantly, that we've learned over the last 3.5 years is that context is key. We cannot just drop in, parachute in solutions easily. Number 2, in terms of solutions, focus on strengthening the national development banks. We're working closely with the Nigerian Development Bank. It's relatively new. It's about 10 years old, very highly effective, and people have talked about it. What we want is the Nigerian Development Bank to become the catalyst in Nigeria for investing in the sanitation economy. That's much more sustainable than us as an outside actor to do that. Number 3, to think what we talked about, thinking beyond the project to the whole system approach. This thing we call the sanitation economy, to think about the enabling environment within that, the regulation, the compliance. And that's when you can bring in the instruments like results-based financing, which we're doing in Uganda, but actually with the government, and we've unlocked public sector resources in Uganda through an RBF approach. Number 4, we need to find a way to make sanitation more within your risk appetite. Looking at how we value the externalities, adjusting those risk appetites, and innovating around this issue of ticket size. That challenge has been done in off-grid energy. A single off-grid energy investment on its own, we know, won't hit the radar. But if you can package them up into 100 or 200 opportunities, then you have a viable ticket size. That's what we're trying to look at in off-grid sanitation. The final point, before I get the long hook, there's a key role for you all sitting here as DFIs, MDB, IFIs. We need you to sweat your balance sheets, not just for sanitation, but across the whole board, that we know how much grant odor is reducing. We're going to have to, all of these things we've described, we'll have to work with you to see how you can finance them as part of the investments in the projects. It's, you know, a lot of these, everything we look at is based on market-based approach. We do market maturity assessments. In some places, these are ready to roll. In Indonesia, for example, they're much more ready for this type of investment. In other countries, less mature, they need a much longer lead-in time. And we need all of us, including the MDBs and the DFIs, you know, to take responsibility. This is how we think, in a very short amount of time, how we think we can start to address the challenge of 3.5 billion people without safely managed sanitation.
Thank you very much, Dominic. I'm just going to pause for a minute. You used the term ODA several times. I want to make sure that everybody understands that means official development assistance, so which some people think of as bilateral aid. So just want to make sure we're all on the same page here. You raised enough questions for a couple of hours of conversation at least, but we'll come back to a couple of them. Before we do that, I want to get to our fourth but not least panelist, Shubhanila Majumdar, who is Managing Director and CEO of the Global Development Incubator for South Asia, and is also the program director for something called the Resilient Water Accelerator. We heard from one of your colleagues who asked a question earlier today. Shubhanil, what is the role that you see of philanthropy to catalyze equitable private finance in the water sector from your perspective? And in particular, given your role with the Resilient Water Accelerator, is there a particular role for climate finance to help out in this area? Thanks.
Hello, am I audible clearly? Yeah. No, thanks, Luis, for the question. And I would like to thank my fellow panelists, Saeed, Luis, as well as Dominic. And I was also first thanks to OECD as well as ISDB for the invitation. Means it was such a kind of fascinating set of discussions around green finance, sustainable finance, and especially Islamic finance. I must be candid that I was not fully knowledgeable about it, but in the last 1.5 days, I realized there's so much potential in the Islamic finance, especially in the work that we do in Lagos as well as in Bangladesh. So yes, I have been trying to connect with my fellow ISDB colleagues to see how we can leverage kind of each other. I think to your kind of question, Luis, and if I can be a little kind of taking maybe like a different kind of direction. We already spoke a lot about the different water problems. We talk a lot about the various financing models, but I see it as, I think I like to look at it from a very system lens point of view. What are the structural issues that has been stopped impeding financing in the water sector? We all know about the data, right? As Dominic mentioned, like 3 billion people have lack of access to water and kind of sanitation. 80–90% of the climate change is seen through water, either floods or through droughts. But still, we know that there is like abysmally low lack of financing, including private and climate financing that in the water sector. So it's not about structural. And I think people have talked a lot in the last couple of days about lack of projects, lack of bankability, deals not happening. And I would like to add a little, like a bit of color to it. Maybe one data point is from the secondary research that we did. We saw that 80–90% of the projects fall off in the early conceptualization phase itself. It means it does not even go to the stage where it is ready for, say, project preparation or, say, in the project finance, where the investors kind of look into it. And that's what I think from a very structural point of view, lies the kind of core issues. If you now add the equity lens, or if you look into the climate lens, I think the problem seems to be getting much more kind of enhanced. When we started engaging in the countries, we got a whole list of projects from the stakeholders. we had investors say to us that we are ready to unlock private finance, climate finance, but it was beyond just a mix and match. There were again some very systemic issue that needs to be addressed to really unlock the flow of kind of capital. And here I think if we need to look beyond just like individual projects and deals. So this projectized approach is where I think we need to kind of think a bit and look at it from a systems as well as from a kind of sector lens and how and what work needs to be done. When we talk about financiers, investors, they're ready to look into projects in the advanced feasibility, much more mature stage, and then they can run for it. But who does this early stage, not even pre-feasibility, but pre-feasibility, some of the ecosystem enabling work that is much required to even move the projects. We talked a lot about the football analogy in the last 1.5 days, although being an Indian, I'm a kind of a cricket fan, but I can just say that although if you want to move the projects to the midfield, then they can be picked up by investors. But from the data that I shared, most of the projects are getting dropped off in the very early conceptual stage because of lack of technical scoping, lack of consideration of the capital and the operating cost, lack of climate inclusion if it is trying to include like climate financing. So those basic parameters are missing. And that's why I see that there's a role of philanthropy who could play this kind of catalytic role. I know that we talk about philanthropy, say from like grant-based, like supporting a one particular projects or particular initiatives or like programs. We even talked about like this catalytic philanthropic funding for making the private sector finance come together to like blended financing instruments. But for me, and again, this is something that we are trying to do at the Resilient Water Accelerator, is something beyond just like that. How can philanthropic capital, which to some donors could be quite patient and risk-taking, be utilized in a meaningful manner so that the projects are moved from the 0 to 1 stage or even from 1 to 5 stage. And that's what we are trying to do at the Resilient Water Accelerator, where our basic goal is how do you really unlock private sector financing through the technical assistance facility that we have set up. Now, I also understand that different philanthropic capital, there's no one single color. There are corporate, there are private, there are public and foundations looking into specific parts of the water value chain. But there are donors, and they need to come together a bit more to really look in some of the upstream level work that they can do. And that's where the RWA has been working, like in countries like in Lagos, Nigeria, as well as in Bangladesh. And I will end up with kind of giving some very kind of concrete examples. Like we have this 3M approach as we are doing within the Resilient Water Accelerator. We look into specific markets, be it the municipalities, be it the textile, and do very evidence-based analysis on the challenges, the key enablers, and then what sort of interventions can bring in private sector finance. Then we have the mechanisms where we bring together the different stakeholders together, and then we look to assess as well as and develop models to which financing can be unlocked. So this is a 3M approach that we have. And what we are doing in Lagos is we started with this citywide risk as resilience, but now we have set up this Lagos Water Partnership, which is just beyond not like a talk shop, but working with the governments, working with the bilaterals, working with the IFIs like the IFC, AFC, the African Development Bank, which is part of the co-chair of the LWP, and looking at water sector financing with very holistic lens. So we are working groups on say governance, we are working groups on say project, finance sector, and in a way we are trying to see how the institutional level partnerships will really unlock kind of funding. So yes, we're looking into specific projects, but also we're looking into some of the systemic barriers, be it around the governance issue, be it around the regulations, be it around the different private sector financing models, be it lender financing, be it Islamic finance that we want to work on, and then how to kind of bring that on. Very two concrete examples, as I mentioned, we see that there are some systemic issues. For example, lack of data is often presented as investors or insurance entities saying that we don't have sufficient data to even take these projects to the next stage. So can an entity like RWA, through its kind of philanthropy capital, do some of the work around kind of building the basic data system so that investors as well as the project sponsors cannot take them forward. That is what we are doing. Like we are doing this groundwater analysis for say Lagos, and we hope that this could be open source. This could be picked up by the different players who can build their projects around those activities. For Bangladesh, we are working with brands and the textile companies as well as financiers looking into what would be the different investable models to unlock financing for the water efficiency as well in the effluent water management plans. So again, it's a very kind of system-less approach, how we can bring in the philanthropic capital, understanding it as different colors, different mandates from like climate, from water, from a health lens, to kind of bring that kind of all together to really kind of mobilize the funding. Lastly, I just conclude that there is no one single donor who can do that. So it needs to be like donor collaborative who needs to work together along with the governments and investors to really unlock funding. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've been given the high sign that we have 15 minutes left. So we're condensing an hour and 15-minute session into an hour. I want to make sure there's time for questions from the audience here who look surprisingly awake and attentive, which we appreciate. I'm going to pose one quick question to the panel, but also to the audience, and I think it's going to be one that we need to think about, but I'll take very quick responses. Dominic's point about 3.5 billion people without safe sanitation reminds us that whatever we come up with here, it has to be at scale. One way to achieve scale is mega projects. And we've heard a lot about that, from people who do multi-$100 million financing and things. Typically, those are for urban residents, but there are still a whole lot of people who live in rural areas. But even in urban areas, a lot of those mega projects aren't necessarily serving the poor. So I guess the question I have is, besides the mega project approach, what other ways do we have to reach scale? And Leslie, this may be a cue for you to give a little discussion about your former employer. But I will put in a plug here, Dominic, for when you asked about urban sanitation and how do we do that. Osprey has been working for a number of years with a group called Fresh Life Sanergy, which works in Nairobi, is reaching a couple of 100,000 people, has eyes on reaching 1 million within a couple of years. It's a disruptive model, but it's also shifting to results-based finance, because the thinking is that the results-based financing is rewarding not just the scale of operation, but also the sustainability of the operation. So I will offer that as one of my ideas. I think uptime is another, but I'm just curious if the panel have any thoughts on, besides the mega project approach, how do we reach scale with innovative ways to reach the people who are not being reached? Small, easy question.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to, as Louis, yeah, okay. So the role that I used to play at water.org and the role that they played was really popularizing microfinance and to actually facilitate people taking their decisions into their own hands and moving faster than a project that was sponsored by their government or sponsored by the World Bank could reach to them. And so while I'm not going to go on about the microfinance model, I do think it is about us thinking about how we design projects, because even internally we had debates about this, right? There could be 1 million loans being dispersed, and we could also accept that maybe not every single loan actually translated into a toilet or water connection, right? There was going to be some I'll use the word again, failure, right? But still, when you're moving at scale, you can accept maybe there's a 3% or a 5% that doesn't achieve what we want. So we can focus really hard on getting that 100, those 100 toilets done exactly perfect, exactly in line with everything that we're saying. Or we can go for scale and accept that there's going to be a certain level of drop off, right? And I think those are the kind of considerations that we in our organizations respectively might need to consider. They are a trade-off, but again, if we're really trying to move towards scale, that might be one area and sort of way that we can transform our thinking, to borrow a phrase.
Yeah, so you talked about how mega urban projects, they can deliver what they deliver, but how do we bring that to the rural areas? Possibly by having mega rural projects. And it's not just being glib about that. It is just dependent, I strongly feel, upon strong monitoring and evaluation systems. The design of those projects, the monitoring of those projects, the response of those projects, and see, let's go back to the mega infrastructure projects. We're able to generate financing for them. We are able to report on them because it is a very tangible, strong systems. It has a lot of visibility. Governments, stakeholders, municipalities, everyone keeps getting involved in that. It's all in major cities, capital cities, to everywhere else, and cosmopolitan areas. But when we go to the rural, it creates a little bit of disconnect. It creates a little bit of verification bias and things like that. That's what we need to tackle a little bit. You can still do. And that's not to say that we cannot have smaller, stronger projects. That certainly is the case. But there is a case to be made that you can have integrated rural development projects with very strong results or based financing and results component, which would be able to put them at least more on par, because they are going to probably be more concessional by nature. So you probably are talking about a lot more stakeholders involved in that. And that's another reason for us to increase the visibility, the verification systems on that.
Thank you. Dominic, quickly.
Yeah, thanks. Quickly. I would look at an approach to wholesale financing. Yes, you've got the mega project, but if, for example, if we had 10 development banks, each with a portfolio of, say, 20 million in sanitation, then you can somebody can issue a sanitation bond or adaptive blue bond and issue a 200 million bond to finance that. It's really important to embed everything we're doing in national financial institutions rather than from external. Local currency, local knowledge, a lot of risks are managed much better by local financial institutions. And then we can bring in the wholesale finance on top of that, which I think other sectors have done successfully.
No, I think the focus that you mentioned in your remarks on local financing institutions makes very good sense. I'm going to just mention for now that Uptime, which was discussed earlier, has an ambition of reaching 100 million people in rural areas, which will work through governments mostly. We have 10 minutes left. I see their hands in the audience. Let me start, however, somebody by the name of Lesha Whitmer actually lobbed multiple questions at us, but I'm only going to take one for now. And this was the one to Dominic that said, good speech. I agree with your plea for non-sewered connections. How do we motivate governments to change their legislation on it?
My experience of our government partners is that the technical people know they're not reaching. So there's a motivation from there. And if you take examples of South Africa, the DG for water is actually legislating because they also know in a water constrained environment that they cannot afford sewered systems. So they're legislating for it. I think this demand is coming from within governments. What we need is for that demand to be expressed to the financing institutions. A short answer.
Thank you. Okay, please. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the comments and interventions. My question is to Syed. Talking about scale, water is eligible for zakah and sadaqah in Islam. So is it possible to establish a philanthropy fund for water sanitation to address scale? In my opinion, it would be over $1 trillion if you get the 2.5% from individual high net worth individuals in the region.
Okay. Yes, theoretically, yes, it is certainly possible to come up with a fund like that, but I probably would not be as sanguine about the amount of finance that you can raise for that. See, philanthropy, and again, you would be able to talk a little bit better than I can, is, from our experience, is not a very easy business. Obtaining the finance from the philanthropist might be the easiest portion. But to deliver it within the year, especially if we're talking about zakat, you want to be able to deliver zakat funds within the year itself. You need to obtain certainly the regulatory procedures, the fatwas and items also. then the funding mechanism for the philanthropists that you would you would want to raise, that has to be a secure one. It has to go through all the banking regulations of those countries. There are certain hurdles in that. The thing that actually helps wash sector when it comes to sadaqah and zakat is the fact that you have results which are immediate. You could have effects on the communities, on the societies, which are very tangible. So you're not doing and neglecting these things. You are building, and you can demonstrate that. So yes, it has its challenges, like with any philanthropic enterprise, but certainly it has a strong thing. And I just wonder why we cannot go beyond, what we normally do for using these funds for education purposes or healthcare purposes. I think the time is there now, especially in a constrained resource and aid environment, to explore these items. So thank you for that, and I will explore that.
Let me just put a caveat on that from somebody who's been funding things in this sector for 25 years. It's really important, at least in the water and sanitation hygiene sector, to make sure you get the right definition of success. A lot of people look at the definition of success as getting somebody a pipe or a well or a toilet. That is the wrong definition of success. The right definition of success is getting somebody a sustainable service. So when I hear that the funds need to be spent in a year, it makes me a little nervous, because we'd have to figure out a way to make sure that the funds are spent for sustainable services and not a one-off situations. I think we have about 5 minutes left. Are there any other questions in the audience? Yes, no, we answered everybody's up over there. Oh, sorry, you were hiding behind the podium, sorry.
Thank you so much. Maybe just the point you raised by our last speaker, Mr. Qadri. Again, you mentioned about zakat funds being used for local water supply or sanitation. I was just wondering, number one, how would that be usually monitored in a government sort of broader results framework? And how would it be scaled up so that you're familiar with how those funds are being used against public sector financing, so that you have a totality and an impact that is measurable in a comprehensive way? Thank you.
Hi, this is a question for Dominic. You mentioned the role of a national public development bank. So how do you see their role being different from that of local commercial banks? And how can, are you planning to engage with them specifically as opposed to other banks in domestic banks?
So the first question. Sorry? You want to?
Yes. So just before I get to that, zakat, by the way, is just one of the 8 instruments we're talking about, right? So you would have a sadaqah-based financing, grant-based financing, which does not necessarily have a time restriction as much as the others as such. To come back to your question, the way to do it properly is not to do it in isolation. You don't treat this as just a charitable enterprise. It is important to have institutions working on these things together, working with the national systems on these items. And that's where I do feel that, and this is not just to say because we're working in Islamic Development Bank, but that's where institutions or MDBs who can, and by the way, IsDB is not the only MDB. Asian Development Bank has its zakat funding programs and projects. And I think that's the right way, because you come in the middle, you obtain those funds, and you're able to deploy them with local participation and national participation on these things. So you have that. So the second aspect and second benefit of working through institutions is that you could use these funds, grant and philanthropic funds, as a form of blending. So that would be scale. So you don't necessarily need to scale grant upon grant. You can use grant and blend it to make it more concessional, whatever lending operations other institutions were able to do so.
And let me just, Dominic, you're going to answer Sophie's question, but to the first question there, this is actually an area where we have good indicators. So if you want to understand what the best indicators are for sustainable service delivery and rural water service, go to the Uptime website. They have 4 specific indicators that cover the volume of water, the contribution of the community to make sure that there's some financial sustainability. Certainly the uptime, which is to say the fact that the water keeps flowing 29 out of 30 days a month, and a quality indicator. So, and if you look at something like Fresh Life Synergy's results-based finance indicators, those would give. So we do know what the indicators are, and those work as well with government as they do with independent service providers.
And briefly, for example, the Nigerian Development Bank is completely publicly owned between the Ministry, the Treasury, EIB, and the African Development Bank. So there is a profit, but it's completely recycled. There's no external profit. Commercial banks obviously make a profit. Now, so those will be fine, I think, in a more mature sanitation market like Indonesia, where the returns and the risk can be managed, but certainly most of the places we'll be operating in, it needs to be a bank that has that development mandate, the publicly owned mandate, because that will set the risk appetite. It'll set all of the parameters by which the lending and all of the operations would happen. And we need a lot more of them.
And unfortunately, I think we've run up against a hard stop at 4 o'clock, which is the time for the next panel to start. So I would like to thank OECD and Islamic Development Bank for inviting us, for putting this topic on the menu for the 2-day roundtable. And I'd very much like to thank the panelists for your perspectives and your wisdom. Really appreciate it. And to the audience too. Thank you.